Welcome to Strange But True. Take a breath, slow down, and listen carefully. Some stories are documented, some are debated, some refuse to be explained. We tell you the stories. You decide what's true. Now, let's begin our journey. History does not begin where we think it does. It begins where records become stable, where time behaves normally, where authority follows rules, where power changes hands. Everything before that is preserved, but not explained. The earliest records do not treat this as a mystery. They treat it as background. Kingship descends. God's rule. Reigns last thousands of years. Then something happens. The record marks it, but it does not describe it. After that point, history becomes recognizable. Time compresses. Authority becomes human. Law replaces presence. Silence replaces explanation. The scribes do not erase the earlier world. They preserve it. They copy it faithfully, even when it no longer reflects reality, even when it no longer makes sense. This tells us something important. The purpose of the record was never to explain origins. It was to preserve continuity, to show that authority flowed forward, even if its beginning could no longer be understood. This is why the contradictions remain. Gods ruling cities, kings living for thousands of years, a sudden flood, an abrupt return to normal time. None of it is resolved, because resolution was not the goal. Preservation was. History, as we inherit it, begins after the rupture, after whatever no longer needed explanation, after whatever no longer applied. This pattern is not unique to a single text. It appears across early records that attempt to preserve continuity rather than explanation. When scribes encountered material that no longer fit the present world, they did not discard it. They archived it. They copied it. They preserved its structure. They maintained its authority, but they did not continue speaking in its language. This suggests a deliberate boundary, not between truth and fiction, but between relevance and inheritance. The earlier world is treated as foundational, not instructional. It establishes legitimacy, not guidance. The later world does not correct it. It builds on top of it. This is why the earliest contradictions remain unresolved. To explain them would have required redefining authority, and authority, once destabilized, cannot easily be repaired. So the records move forward instead. They allow the past to remain intact, even when it no longer applies. This is not confusion, it is conservation. The scribes understood that history was not the complete account of everything that happened. It was a framework, a structure that allowed the present to justify itself. And that framework began after the rupture. Everything before it becomes context, background, a world remembered but not revisited. This may be why the earliest world feels so distant, not because it was imagined, but because it belonged to a framework that no longer functioned. The scribes did not attempt to revive it. They did not reinterpret it. They did not translate it into modern terms. They left it where it was, preserved but untouched. What followed required explanation. Law needed structure. Power needed justification. Time needed limits. And once those systems were in place, the earlier world could not return. Not because it was false, but because it was no longer usable. What remains is a record that does not argue with itself. It does not reconcile contradictions. It does not resolve tension. It preserves them. The earliest world is left intact, not because it was understood, but because it was accepted. And when acceptance was no longer possible, explanation began. That is where history, as we recognize it, finally takes shape. The earlier world is not mythologized, it is archived, and the silence that follows is deliberate. Not because the scribes lacked imagination, but because they practiced restraint. They recorded what remained and left what ended without commentary. That silence marks the boundary, not between myth and history, but between two kinds of worlds, one that required no justification and one that could not exist without it. History begins at the moment explanation becomes necessary. Everything before that remains unresolved. History has a way of hiding the truth inside what it chooses not to explain. Inside tales, inside myths, inside legends, inside things that feel just a little off. If this story held your attention, subscribe to Strange But True, because sometimes what sounds unbelievable is exactly where the truth hides.